What's going on, ladies and gents, boys and girls, guardians of all ages, Joker back again, once again. So I've noticed in the community that a lot of people don't quite understand Uldren. Now, I have a video from the past, so some bits of it are not going to be necessarily relative to the story right now, but I think the overall character study of Uldren is still relevant, so I'm just going to re-upload it for all of you to enjoy.
Previously on Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Tell me how my brother died.
The line between light and dark is so very thin. Do you know which side you're on?
He died for you. Everything he did to save you.
My brother was strong, clever, devoted, but suggestible. I knew my plans put him at risk. I was not surprised to feel him die.
He killed our friend.
Yes, I'm sure you'll miss it. Were you satisfied by your vengeance?
I refuse to bury any more friends.
You won't have to. Uldren Sov is mine.
I wasn't.
And now, the conclusion.
When Cade passed, I saw the fracturing of the Vanguard as a path towards inevitable failure. Still, it has proved impossible to fill his seat. I believed that I would be too weak to lead without the balance added by his unique perspective. As it turns out, his life was but one in an eternity of choices. Zavala, I don't want... Relax, I'm not offering you the job. Unless you killed Cade, and we've had the wrong man this whole time. If I did, would you forgive me? I'd understand, he said and smiled. Ikora told me back then that an object in motion stays in motion. I've always admired that phrase, but I must admit, it can be difficult to adhere to. Anna shook her head. That's just physics, a fundamental aspect of life. He watched Anna's mood lighten as she considered his words. We find the footholds we can, and make the best steps given the ground we have before us.
Why is the city breathing down my neck?
Why don't you put that down so we can talk?
Out here in the wild, this is how we talk.
What's going on, ladies and gents, boys and girls, guardians of all ages, Joker back again, once again, and just over a year ago, I wrote quite possibly my favorite Destiny lore video of all time. Why Uldren Sov is the best written character in all of Destiny. Not that that really says all that much when Ace of Spades has had more of a character arc than 90% of the cast. But it's not something that should be understated either. Uldren is fundamentally one of the most fleshed out and well-rounded characters in all of Destiny. In that original lore video, we talk about the fundamental forces that created Uldren, and how he's not too dissimilar from Game of Thrones' Jaime Lannister. Jaime Lannister, for those of you who do not know, is this kind of arrogant, Prince Charming-esque character who is also banging his sister. And if that wasn't bad enough, by the end of the first episode of Game of Thrones, he attempts to murder a small child by pushing him out a window in order to cover up his incestuous relationship. Though there is a complexity to this choice that is seldom talked about, because if it was discovered that Jaime and Cersei were having an incestuous relationship, at best, it would be both of them being executed. At worst, it would be all of them and their children. Uldren, by contrast, is presented in a remarkably similar but not exact way. Though, I'm not saying, I'm just saying.
Love is fleeting, but devotion.
And all of that could have been fine. Uldren could have been this two-dimensional, annoying asshat off in the background being a cocky, arrogant spy master with weird longings for his sister. However, much like Jaime Lannister, Uldren was put in a position where it was kill or be killed or re-imprisoned, thus failing his sister and leaving her to die. At least in his mind, you do have to remember he was possessed. However, the choice of killing Cade wasn't an invalid one, even if the narrative that set it up was a bit convoluted, and they spoiled Cade's death and who his killer was months in advance, leaving the community time to basically grow to hate Uldren without understanding why things happened the way that they did. But in these singular character-defining actions, the killing of Cade and the attempted murder of Bran, we see events unfold that would have farther-reaching consequences than the initial act itself. The Civil War of Westeros in Game of Thrones, and the entire story mode of Forsaken, leading to the execution of both Uldren and Riven, which, as of now, has forever changed the face of the Dreaming City. And in both instances, an unseen greater enemy is made stronger. In Game of Thrones, the others are made stronger by the death and destruction and the weakening of Westeros as a whole because of the Civil War. In Destiny, Savathun is made stronger because of the perpetual murder battery we helped her to create. But Uldren didn't just wake up one day as a total asshole. Like Jaime and Cersei, both Uldren and Mara are the product of millions upon millions of choices made by them and for them for centuries. And, much like Zavala quoted Ikora in the lore dump at the beginning of this video, an object in motion stays in motion. I explain this in more detail in my Why Uldren is the Best Character in All of Destiny video, but here's a couple of passages from the lore that should contextualize all of this. Mara, I picked you flowers. The Queen's retinue parts before Uldren, astonished eyes flickering between his face, his wounds, and the potted flowers cupped in his hands. Some of them see a madman, and they reach for weapons before they remember. This is Uldren, Prince of the Awoken, beneficiary of the Queen's limitless indulgence. Asphodela is the name. He kneels and offers it to his sister. It grew only in the Black Garden until today. We will plant it here, in our domain, where it will take root and flourish. It will remind the people of our twin heritage. For a terrible moment, Mara is unreadable. Then she smiles and beckons. Our brother has obtained the Black Garden and returned to us. Come forward. She peels a single petal from the flower and lays it across her fingertips, holds it up to the light. Magnificent. Ilian, see to it. She passes it off. Uldren swallows protest. He hoped she might plant it herself. Afterwards, in private, she's silent and still. He tells her everything he remembers. Did you see the heart? She asks softly. Whatever the heart of that place is, he says, pacing. It's a seed, I think. A seed left behind to grow, like a note of glimmer, or... The idea strikes him like a thunderbolt, or a tripwire, bait to attract those who would seek out and destroy what they do not understand. Bait for guardians, bait to mark some milestone in the traveler's recovery. I told you to never go there, Mara says. Her eyes burn. She draws her cloak tight. Are you not devoted to me? Sister, he says, of course I am. Yet you defy me. Yes, Uldren thinks. Yes. Aren't those the same thing? How could you care at all for something that never surprises you? He feels, suddenly, utterly, alone. Uldren thinks to himself, he wants his sister's approval. He knows and accepts that, but he wants her approval for something that she did not anticipate, did not plan or foresee, and did not account for. He wants her to thank him with surprise. His mentality seems to be, if you hurl yourself away from someone to test the length of your chain, you cannot know the chain's length until it draws you short. Does that make sense? Uldren thinks so. Uldren is afraid so. Either he is truly free of his sister, free to choose to stand at her side, to choose of his own free will, or the chain is longer than he's managed to run. Uldren's seemingly suicidal need for love and attention and validation is in large part Mara's fault, as we see in Ravalanche 3 in a conversation between Mara and Jur Ido. Take a listen. Maybe that's your problem. She flicks Uldren in the chest, leaving a purple bruise fading. What is it with you two anyways? You never talk about him. You never seem to think about him at all. But he's dashing himself to pieces for you. How do you live as his favorite and only sister for so many centuries and hardly ever smile at him? Secrets, Mara thinks. You've got to have secrets from each other, so there's room for him to fill in the gaps with his own happy illusions. Two ships joined together rigidly will tear each other apart if they try to move, but a loose tether leaves some room to maneuver, and can be more quickly disengaged if necessary. Uldren is the product of Mara's abuse, neglect, and manipulation. But that abuse, neglect, and manipulation only stems from the fact that Mara is an imperfect being, one that has been cast in the role of a queen and a god by the people around her. She is alone, and in not wanting to lose Uldren, she does just that. This is ultimately a story of two people's toxic codependency ripping them apart, which segues nicely into Uldren's death and the events after Forsaken. The Dawning welcomes everyone. Eva Levante. For the last 3 weeks, the Guardian has been camping in a rusted-out shipping container, far off the main pathways that are always buzzing with sparrows. He stays out of the way of other Guardians. If he can't do that, he keeps his helmet on. Always. All he has to his name is some beat-up gear, a ring, and a silk sheet. Those are the things he woke up with. He wears the ring on a chain, and keeps the sheet as a comforting reminder of something he can't remember. Sometimes he wears it draped over his shoulder. The fabric is so fine that it makes him think of the place he must have come from before this life, and how much nicer it is than where he is now. He spends his days alone. Other Guardians are an unpredictable source of pain and confusion, and they see him the same way. Some react to him with outright hostility. Others are overcome by some personal and unexplained grief. He doesn't know why. That was the most painful lesson of being reborn. It's always better to be alone. So, he's always alone now. Except for his ghost. One night he sits with his head against his knees and listens to the distant snapping of gunfire. He hasn't seen anyone in about a week, but he can hear them. Somehow, that makes the loneliness worse. More potent. Did you know, his ghost says, bright but gentle? The purple glint of his shell reflects the half-light outside the crate. In the last city, they're celebrating. They call it the Dawning. It's a celebration of friendship and hope and warmth. The Guardian keeps his eyes closed and forces down his bitterness. The silence lingers between them, heavy and filled with unsaid things, until his ghost gently bumps his shoulder. To feel good, they say to each other, "Happy Dawning." Still, the Guardian says nothing, and his own silence makes him sick with himself. His ghost has never doubted him, never doubted anyone, really. He is a well of relentless optimism, and as infuriating as that is, it's also heartbreaking, and comforting, and a relief. The Guardian is not going to be the one who disappoints him. There's been too much disappointment in this life already. Happy Dawning, he says. Here we see two types of redemption arc triggers. One where we have the death of the character that needs to be redeemed. And while in most, if not all stories, this death would be some kind of heroic sacrifice that ultimately clears the name of the character and redeems them, this, in my opinion, is the weakest kind of redemption arc. The character is dead. They don't have to face the consequences or realities of their action. They don't have to atone. They're dead. However, Destiny subverts this. Uldren as a character died scared, alone, beaten and broken. He was lied to and ultimately failed. Death would mark the lowest point in Uldren's story arc. But in Destiny, death can also be a beginning. There is an interesting reality that is never really explored within the universe of Destiny. With the resurrection of Uldren, we know that you don't have to be a paragon of virtue in your last life to be resurrected. However, this means that some of the most horrific people in human history could have been revived. That said, none of that matters because outside of being an exo, and even then, the memories of the Risen are erased. And with a handful of lore exceptions, generally speaking, people are not revived in the eras where their actions are relevant. Though you'd have to imagine, by sheer probability, that there's more than one Guardian who had a family, who had a wife, who had a husband, who was a father or a mother, who died and was resurrected with no memory of their family, and their family's still out there. Side note, there really does need to be a lore story about that happening and how the people involved reconcile with it. That would be excellent world building. Uldren exists as a wholly unique character, as the lore for Amnesia tells us. When people see him, some react with outright hostility, others are overcome by some personal, unexplained grief. And as unfair as this might be, Uldren bears the burden of his past life, even if he doesn't remember it. even if that wasn't him. And this might be why other Guardians react the way that they do, because the cognitive dissonance of knowing that this isn't Uldren, but also still seeing Uldren, would be hard for people to just normally even wrap their mind around. The second type of redemption arc we see in the Amnesia card is redemption by another. In a lot of stories, this is conveyed by the love of a woman trope, where a character wants to redeem themselves because they've fallen in love with someone. However, in the Amnesia card, we see that Uldren doesn't want to disappoint his ghost. In the Amnesia card, we also see that the seeds for both the failing of his redemption arc and its success are there. He's angry, he's lonely, he's confused and sad and depressed about the way that he's been treated. However, we also see him swallow that, to rise above it, to try to be a good person to at least his ghost. We also see a longing to belong, and this longing could result in Uldren's redemption, or his failed redemption. After all, it's not a true redemption arc if the character doesn't have flaws that they need to overcome and make mistakes along the way. As a person in his past life, Uldren's failures boil down to his toxic codependency with his sister. And just so we're clear, just so people don't think I'm hating on the Queen, they're both in the wrong. They're both broken, damaged people trying to cling on to one another and doing more damage than good. Why? Because people are complicated. But in that complication, we see Uldren's eventual choices unfold. Does the new Uldren go back home and fall into the same trappings that led him to his original downfall? Or does he take up his responsibility as the Hunter Vanguard? Personally, I'd like to see both. In Game of Thrones, before it got cancelled and we never got an 8th season, we see Jaime, after the loss of his hand and his identity, try to go back to some form of normality. But he can't. He's been humbled. Everything that he was has been torn down and stripped away. And not only did he simply not belong in that world anymore, he looked around and he could no longer ignore what he saw. And his honor, something he fought to reclaim, was now torn between love, loyalty, and duty. And ultimately, at the end of Season 7, he chose duty. It's too bad we won't see how that pans out, at least until the books, because the writers decided to wait for the books and do it properly. So maybe eventually, one day, we'll see how that ends. It would not be surprising to see Uldren brought to the city, where he's cast in the role of the Hunter Vanguard, and he learns who he was and what he'd done, and then he relapses to who he was. Or at least a version of it, because he doesn't have those memories, he can't be that person again, but he can try to be, and he goes back to the Awoken. But ultimately, he's not that person anymore. So he comes back to the city, returning home and starting a new life after coming to terms with his old one. Of course, the inverse is also possible, where he returns to the Awoken and falls back into the trappings of trying to be who he was, thus failing his redemption arc. However, failed redemption arcs without something to say about the character or the morality of the universe is just unsatisfactory. And while this backslide into old habits is more realistic, unless there's a greater narrative point or payoff, the subversion of expectations, just to subvert expectations, often ruins the catharsis of the viewer, making them feel like the entire exercise was pointless. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Remember to like, but only if you did, subscribe for more of my content, and feel free to donate to my Patreon if you are feeling particularly generous. But above all else, stay frosty.